3 weeks after the betrayal, almost everyone in the underworld had already decided that Zayu Kuros was a dead man who had not yet been buried. The doctors at Arclight Medical Center never said it that directly, because men with power were always given softer words and cleaner lies, but every report meant the same thing. His brain activity was almost gone, his body could not breathe without machines, and the chance of him returning as the alpha who once ruled Black Snake was so small that even the surgeons had stopped pretending to hope. He lay in the center of room 9002, a private suite sealed behind guarded doors and tinted glass, with monitors glowing beside him and a ventilator lifting his chest in a rhythm that did not belong to him. To the city, Zayu had been the Ice Alpha, a man whose name made rival bosses lower their voices and whose decisions could move money, weapons, and fear through entire districts before dawn. But inside that room, he was only a silent body beneath a dark hospital gown, his hands resting powerless on the sheets while men who once obeyed him began quietly measuring the distance between his last breath and their own ambition. No one entered room 9002 because they loved him. Doctors came to record numbers. Lawyers came to prepare documents. Members of Black Snake came with lowered eyes and careful expressions, not to mourn him, but to confirm how much time remained before the throne became empty. Even the guards outside his door no longer looked like soldiers protecting a king. They looked like men assigned to watch over something expensive until the owner stopped existing. The only person who came without wanting anything from him was Noel Asher. Noel worked the night cleaning shift at Arclight Medical Center, and to most people on the 9th floor, he was part of the building rather than a person inside it. He moved quietly with a cart of fresh linen, disinfectant, gloves, and trash bags, always keeping his head low enough to avoid questions, but not so low that anyone could accuse him of hiding something. He was an Omega with a small child at home, a body kept steady by cheap suppressors, and a life balanced so tightly between rent, medicine, and food that one missed shift could make everything collapse. The first time Noel entered Zayu's room, he was afraid enough that his fingers tightened around the spray bottle until his knuckles hurt. He had heard the whispers from nurses, guards, and doctors who thought the cleaning staff did not understand danger. Zayu Kuros was not just a patient. He was the head of Black Snake. He was the kind of alpha other alphas feared. Even unconscious, even surrounded by tubes, he carried a pressure in the room that made Noel want to finish quickly and leave before anyone noticed how fast his heart was beating. For the first few nights, Noel barely looked at him. He wiped the rails, changed the trash, cleaned the glass, and left with the same careful silence he used everywhere else in the hospital. But silence had a strange weight in room 9002, and after several nights of seeing no visitor sit beside the bed, no hand straighten the blanket with tenderness, and no voice speak to Zayu as if he were still human, Noel found himself slowing down. One night, while rain tapped softly against the window, Noel murmured without meaning to, "It rained again today. Neo thinks thunder is the sky getting angry because someone stole its dinner." The machines answered with their steady beeping, and Zayu did not move, but saying the words made the room feel less like a tomb. Noel glanced toward the bed, embarrassed by his own foolishness, then continued wiping the bedside table. After that, talking became easier. Every night, when the guards stopped paying attention and the nurses were busy with other patients, Noel would speak in a low voice while he cleaned. He told Zayu about Neo, his little boy who drew crooked stars on old receipts and insisted that broken toys only needed better names. He spoke about the heater in their apartment that worked only when it wanted to, about the landlord who always came when Noel had the least money, and about the suppressors that had become so expensive he sometimes cut doses in half and prayed his body would forgive him for it. "You probably had people handle all your problems before they ever reached you," Noel said once, folding a clean blanket near Zayu's feet. "But I guess that doesn't mean you were happy. People don't look this lonely by accident." He regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth, because it was dangerous to speak honestly around a man like Zayu Kuros, even if that man could not open his eyes. Still, the confession stayed between them, held safely by the machines and the darkened room, and Noel returned the next night despite knowing he should not become attached to a patient everyone had already given up on. Deep inside the place where Zayu's mind had sunk, Noel's voice was not clear at first. It came through the emptiness like warmth pressing against ice, soft and persistent, never demanding anything from him and never calling him king. He could not move toward it, could not answer it, and could not even understand all the words, but whenever that voice faded, the darkness around him became colder. The doctors believed there was no meaningful response in him, but they did not know that the dead alpha they were preparing to abandon was holding on to the sound of an omega who treated him like a person. While Noel unknowingly kept Zayu from slipping further away, Silu Veron prepared to end what the bullets had failed to finish. Silu was Zayu's second-in-command, the man the organization trusted to protect Black Snake until its leader recovered or died. Years earlier, Zayu had pulled him out of an underground ABO fighting ring and given him a place beside him, but gratitude had slowly curdled into resentment as Silu spent year after year standing behind the one man no one could surpass. In a private office far from the hospital room, Silu listened as a senior doctor explained that the medical committee had reached its conclusion. There was no realistic chance of recovery, and if the legal authority approved, life support could be withdrawn in 48 hours. Silu lowered his gaze to the documents as if the decision pained him, then signed with a steady hand. "We should not force him to suffer," he said, and his voice was calm enough to fool anyone who wanted to believe in loyalty. That same night, Noel finished his shift in room 9002 later than usual. His body ached, his suppressor was wearing thin, and he knew Neo would be asleep by the time he got home, but he still paused beside Zayu's bed before leaving. For reasons he did not fully understand, the thought of never speaking to this silent alpha again made his chest feel tight. "Neo asked about you today," Noel whispered, his hand resting lightly on the cleaning cart. "I told him you were sleeping. He said scary-looking people probably make the best shields, so if you ever wake up, I think he'd like you." The monitor continued its rhythm, and Noel gave a tired, sad smile as he turned to go. Then the sound changed. It was only a small irregular jump at first, so slight that Noel almost convinced himself he had imagined it. But when he turned back toward the screen, the line moved again with a fragile pulse of activity that had not been there before. Noel stood frozen beside the bed, the empty room suddenly feeling as if something inside it had heard him and was trying, with all the strength it had left, to answer. Noel barely slept after seeing the monitor react. For the rest of the night, the image stayed trapped in his mind like something he was afraid to touch too closely in case it disappeared. Every logical part of him insisted it had probably been a machine error or a meaningless reflex from a dying body, but another part of him could not forget the timing. The monitor had changed only after he spoke to Zayu, only after he mentioned Neo. The next evening, Noel returned to Arclight Medical Center carrying a feverish child against his chest. Neo had started coughing before dawn, and by morning his skin felt dangerously hot. Noel had spent hours trying everything he could think of: cold towels, diluted medicine, warm soup the boy barely touched, but the fever only climbed higher. The cheap clinic near their apartment refused treatment without payment up front, and the pharmacist downstairs looked almost apologetic while explaining that the medication Noel needed cost more than half his remaining savings. By sunset, Noel's body was trembling from exhaustion and stress. His suppressor had nearly stopped working, leaving a faint sweetness leaking into the air around him no matter how carefully he tried to hide it. He hated that smell when he was struggling. It made him feel exposed, weak, too easy for the world to notice. At 8 in the evening, his phone rang. The convenience store manager did not even let Noel explain properly before cutting him off. "If you miss another shift, don't bother coming back tomorrow." The call ended before Noel could answer. For a long moment, he simply stood in the narrow apartment kitchen, staring at the cracked screen of his phone, while Neo whimpered weakly from the couch behind him. Outside, rain hammered against the windows hard enough to shake the frame. Noel closed his eyes. He had already lost one job this month because Neo got sick too often. Rent was overdue. His suppressors were nearly gone. Now the store job was gone too. And Neo was burning up in his arms. By midnight, desperation pushed him somewhere pride never would have allowed. The hospital. Not the emergency room. Noel already knew he could never afford that bill. Instead, he entered through the employee service entrance with Neo wrapped tightly in blankets against his chest. The little boy's face was flushed with fever, his breathing uneven as he clung weakly to Noel's hoodie. The basement corridors smelled like bleach and steam. Noel moved quickly past laundry carts and supply rooms, trying not to draw attention. He found an empty corner behind stacked linen bins and sat there for almost 20 minutes, rocking Neo while whispering soft reassurances into his hair. "It's okay," he murmured quietly. "Daddy's here. Just a little longer." But Neo kept crying. Not loudly at first, just weak, painful little sounds that became sharper every few minutes as the fever worsened. Noel's panic slowly rose with each noise. If the night supervisor found him hiding a child inside the hospital, he would lose his cleaning position immediately. Then they would truly have nowhere left to go. His eyes lifted toward the service elevator at the end of the hall. 9th floor. Room 9002. The warmest room in the building. Noel hated himself for even considering it, but exhaustion eventually crushed the last of his hesitation. He stood slowly, adjusted Neo higher against his chest, and stepped into the elevator before he could change his mind. The 9th floor was quiet when the doors opened. The guards outside Zayu's suite were distracted by a sports broadcast on one of their phones and barely glanced at Noel as he pushed his cleaning cart toward the room. To them, he was invisible again. Just another worker doing another late-night shift. The moment the door closed behind him, Noel finally let out the breath he had been holding. The room was dim except for the pale blue glow of the monitors beside Zayu's bed. The Alpha remained exactly as before, motionless beneath white sheets, the ventilator breathing in slow mechanical rhythm beside him. "I'm sorry," Noel whispered immediately, though he was not even sure who he was apologizing to anymore. "I just need somewhere warm for a little while." Neo whimpered harder in his arms. Noel sat in the chair near the bed and tried to soothe him, but the fever made the child restless and miserable. The little boy tossed weakly beneath the blankets, small hands clutching helplessly at Noel's shirt, while tears slid down his flushed cheeks. "Daddy's here," Noel kept repeating softly. "It's okay. Please calm down a little." But nothing worked. And with every passing minute, Noel became more aware of how dangerous the situation was. If a nurse heard crying inside the VIP suite, questions would come immediately. Then footsteps. Then security. Then the end of everything. Panic tightened in Noel's chest until breathing itself became difficult. The stress triggered another wave of unstable pheromones. Sweet Omega sent spilling heavier into the room, despite the failing suppressor in his system. He pressed a shaking hand against his mouth, trying desperately to calm himself before instinct completely overwhelmed him. That was when his eyes landed on Zayu's chest. The thermal blankets covering the Alpha kept the bed warm to support circulation. Heat radiated faintly from beneath the sheets, steady and constant in the freezing room. Noel hesitated. Then slowly he stood. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. With trembling care, he lowered Neo onto the broad chest of the unconscious Alpha. The effect was immediate. Neo's crying weakened almost instantly as the warmth surrounded him. The child curled instinctively against Zayu's body, tiny fingers clutching weakly at the fabric of the hospital gown. Within seconds, his ragged breathing began slowing into softer, uneven breaths. Relief hit Noel so hard it nearly made his knees give out. But then the monitors changed. A sharp, irregular beep cut through the silence. Noel's head snapped toward the screen. The heart monitor had shifted from its dull, artificial rhythm into something stronger. Uneven at first, then faster, more responsive. The brain activity monitor flickered. Once, twice. Then the line spiked hard enough to trigger alarms across the room. Noelle stumbled backward in shock just as the suite doors burst open. Two nurses rushed inside with a resident doctor close behind them. "What happened?" the doctor demanded while staring at the monitors. "He's crashing," one nurse said urgently, already reaching toward the emergency cart. Another nurse moved quickly toward the bed and froze. "There's a child here." The room exploded into confusion. "Get the boy away from the patient," the resident ordered immediately. The nurse reached down toward Neo, and suddenly, a hand locked around her wrist. The entire room went still. Noelle's breath stopped. Zayu's fingers tightened with terrifying strength around the nurse's arm as the machines screamed around him. Then his eyes opened. Cold, sharp, fully aware. He did not look at the doctors. He did not look at the alarms. His gaze fell directly onto the small child curled against his chest. And his voice, rough from weeks of silence, filled the room. "Don't," he rasped softly. "Touch him." For several seconds after Zayu opened his eyes, nobody in room 9002 moved. The alarms continued screaming through the suite while the nurse remained frozen beneath the crushing grip around her wrist. The resident doctor stared at the monitors in open disbelief. His face drained of color as brain activity readings climbed higher and higher across the screen. 3 weeks. 3 weeks without meaningful response. And now the man everyone had already prepared to bury was awake and fully conscious. Noelle stood near the wall with his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He should have felt relieved. Instead, fear mixed violently with shock inside his chest because the alpha watching the room did not look weak or confused. Zayu looked dangerous. Even lying half-connected to machines, his presence filled the entire suite with suffocating pressure. His dark eyes moved slowly from the nurse to the trembling Omega standing nearby, then finally settled on the small child sleeping against his chest. Only then did his grip loosen. The nurse stumbled backward immediately, clutching her wrist while breathing hard. Nobody tried touching Neo again. The doctor recovered first. "Mr. Kuros, you've suffered severe neurological trauma. You need to remain calm while we examine." "No." Zayu's voice came out rough from disuse, but the authority inside it cut through the room instantly. Speaking clearly cost him visible effort, yet somehow that only made him more intimidating. His hand shifted protectively over Neo's small back. The child had fallen asleep completely during the chaos, curled trustingly against the alpha's chest as though he belonged there. The doctor hesitated before trying again more carefully. "The boy has a high fever. We need to move him." Zayu's eyes sharpened immediately. "No one touches him." This time nobody argued. Noelle could barely process what he was seeing. The doctors had described Zayu as nearly brain dead less than 24 hours earlier. Now the same man was glaring at medical staff like a predator deciding whether they were threats. Then Zayu looked directly at him. The room suddenly felt too warm. Noelle's breath caught as those sharp eyes settled fully on him for the first time, not vaguely or instinctively like before, but with clear awareness. There was exhaustion in Zayu's face, and pain, but beneath both was recognition strong enough to make Noelle's stomach tighten. "You," Zayu said quietly. Just one word, but Noelle immediately understood. The alpha knew his voice. The realization sent a strange rush of heat through Noelle's body, made worse by the unstable suppressor already struggling inside his system. He took an unconscious step back. I should go," Noelle managed weakly. Zayu's gaze darkened almost immediately. "No." The answer came too fast. Too instinctive. Everyone in the room noticed it. The silence afterward stretched awkwardly until the resident doctor finally cleared his throat and motioned for the nurses to continue working around the bed. Over the next hour, the hospital descended into complete chaos. Senior doctors flooded the floor. Security tightened across the entire wing. Phone calls moved through the city faster than wildfire. By dawn, every important figure connected to Black Snake already knew the impossible truth. The Ice Alpha had returned. But inside room 9002, Zayu seemed focused on only three things: the Omega, the child, and the scent lingering softly in the air around them. The doctors eventually convinced him to allow Neo to receive treatment, but only after setting up a portable bed beside his own. Even then, Zayu watched every movement with cold suspicion until the medication lowered the child's fever enough for him to sleep peacefully. Noel remained near the corner of the room the entire time, tense and exhausted. Part of him wanted to leave immediately before Black Snake members arrived. Another part of him could not bring himself to walk away after everything that had happened. Around sunrise, the room finally became quiet again. Most of the staff left after finishing examinations, though armed guards now stood both inside and outside the suite. Zayu had removed the oxygen mask despite repeated complaints from doctors, and while his body still looked weakened from weeks in bed, the force of his presence seemed to grow stronger every hour he stayed awake. Noel tried not to stare. It became difficult not to when Zayu's attention kept returning to him. "You're afraid of me?" the Alpha said suddenly. Noel looked up in surprise. Zayu was watching him from the bed with unreadable eyes. Noel hesitated before answering honestly. "I think everyone's afraid of you." For the first time, something almost resembling amusement flickered briefly across Zayu's face. "But you still talk to me." Noel lowered his eyes immediately. "You looked lonely." The answer seemed to affect Zayu more than Noel expected. The Alpha went silent after that, his gaze drifting slowly toward the sleeping child nearby. The room remained still for several long moments before he finally spoke again. Quieter this time. "Nobody talks honestly around me." Noel did not know how to answer that, because it was true. Even now, doctors, guards, and Black Snake members kept watching Zayu carefully, measuring every reaction before speaking. Nobody relaxed near him. Nobody forgot what kind of alpha he was. But Noel remembered the man lying unconscious beneath cold hospital lights while everyone waited for him to die. And somehow that version of Zayu felt harder to fear. Late that afternoon, another problem appeared. Noel's suppressor completely wore off. He noticed the symptoms immediately. His body temperature rose too quickly, and a faint sweetness spread through the room stronger than before. Panic hit him almost instantly. Not here. Not near a dominant alpha. Noel stood abruptly from his chair, avoiding eye contact. "I need to leave." Zayu's gaze sharpened at once. "Why?" "It's nothing." The Alpha inhaled once slowly. Then his expression changed. Noel's pheromones were unstable, frayed badly from stress, exhaustion, and cheap suppressors pushed far beyond safe limits. To another Omega, the scent might have only seemed sweeter than usual. To Zayu, it smelled wrong. Damaged. His voice lowered dangerously. "Who gave you those suppressors?" Noel froze. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." The pressure in the room shifted instantly. Even the guards near the door straightened nervously as Zayu's alpha pheromones thickened beneath his anger. Noel swallowed hard. "They're all I can afford." The silence afterward felt heavy. Zayu stared at him for several seconds before finally speaking again. "From now on, you won't use them anymore." Noel blinked in confusion. "What?" "I'll replace them." "No, you don't need to." "I said I will." The authority in Zayu's voice made refusal feel impossible. Noel's chest tightened unexpectedly at the words. Nobody had ever said something like that to him before with such certainty, as if his suffering was not normal and should never have happened in the first place. Before Noel could respond again, Neo stirred weakly in the portable bed beside them. Almost instantly, Zayu's attention shifted. The Alpha leaned forward carefully despite obvious pain, and adjusted the blanket around the sleeping child with surprisingly gentle movements. Neo relaxed again within seconds, tiny fingers unconsciously curling around two of Zayu's larger ones. Noel watched the scene quietly. Something about it felt dangerous in a completely different way now. Not because Zayu frightened him, but because the room no longer felt cold when the Alpha looked at them. That night, Noel stayed later than he should have. And when exhaustion finally caused him to drift asleep beside the bed, he never noticed the moment Zayu carefully pulled a blanket over his shoulders before settling back against the pillows, eyes fixed silently on the Omega sleeping within arm's reach. By the fourth day after Zayu woke up, the atmosphere inside Arclight Medical Center had changed completely. Doctors still entered room 9002 with careful professionalism. But now there was tension beneath every movement. Black Snake members began appearing on the 9th floor again, dressed in dark suits and speaking in low voices outside the suite. Nurses avoided eye contact whenever Zayu looked their way, and even the guards stationed inside the room carried themselves differently now that the man they had expected to bury was sitting upright in bed watching everything around him with cold awareness. But the biggest change was not the hospital. It was Zayu himself. Noel noticed it most during the quiet moments. The Alpha barely slept unless Noel and Neo were nearby. Whenever Noel stepped out of the room for too long, the atmosphere inside the suite grew noticeably heavier. Zayu never openly asked him to stay, yet his eyes always followed Noel back toward the door with the same dark intensity every time he tried to leave. And Noel was beginning to understand something dangerous. Zayu's instincts had attached themselves to them. At first, Noel tried convincing himself it was temporary, just lingering alpha protectiveness caused by the unusual bond formed during recovery. But the signs kept growing stronger. Zayu refused to let unfamiliar alphas enter the room alone while Noel was present. He memorized the exact times Noel's suppressor needed replacing and became visibly irritated whenever the Omega skipped meals from stress. Even Neo had started climbing naturally onto Zayu's bed during the evenings, curling against the Alpha's side as though he had known him much longer than a few days. The strangest part was how natural it all began to feel. That frightened Noel more than anything. Late one evening, Noel stood near the sink washing fruit for Neo while the little boy sat cross-legged beside Zayu on the hospital bed drawing crooked stars across a napkin. The sight should have looked absurd. One of the most feared alphas in the city was sitting silently with a child balanced against his arm, while listening with complete focus to a long explanation about why stars should always have smiling faces. Yet somehow, Zayu looked calmer than Noel had ever seen him. "You made the eyes uneven again," Neo complained seriously. Zayu glanced down at the drawing. "Then fix them. That's because you're bad at this." A quiet huff of amusement left the Alpha. Noel froze slightly at the sound. It was small, barely there, but it was still laughter. For a moment, the room felt warm enough that Noel almost forgot who Zayu really was. Then the lights went out. The entire suite dropped into darkness so suddenly that Neo startled against the bed. A second later, emergency red lights flickered on across the room. Every instinct inside Noel tightened immediately. Something was wrong. Outside the door, shouting erupted through the hallway. One of the guards cursed sharply into his radio before a gunshot cracked through the corridor. Neo flinched hard. Noel's heart nearly stopped. "What's happening?" he whispered. Zayu was already moving. Ignoring the 4 lines still attached to his arm, he pulled it free and stood from the bed for the first time without assistance. The movement clearly hurt. Noel saw the brief tension in his jaw and the stiffness in his body after weeks of recovery, but none of it slowed him down. The Alpha looked terrifying standing there barefoot beneath the red emergency lights. Cold. Focused. Awake in a way Noel had not fully understood until now. Another gunshot exploded outside. Then screaming. The door burst open. One of the guards stumbled inside bleeding from the shoulder. "Boss!" he hissed urgently. They got past security. Behind him, armed men were already moving down the corridor. Neo started crying instantly. Noel grabbed the child and backed away from the door, panic surging violently through his body. His pheromones reacted almost immediately. Sweet Omega scent flooding the room, as fear pushed his suppressors toward collapse. The reaction in Zayu was immediate. His head snapped toward Noel. Every trace of calm disappeared from the Alpha's face. "Stay behind me," he ordered. The pressure of dominant pheromones exploded through the suite hard enough to make Noel's knees weaken. It was not directed at him. It was directed outward like a territorial warning sharp enough to suffocate the entire room. Then the attackers entered. 3 men in black rushed through the doorway with silenced pistols raised. The first barely crossed the threshold before Zayu reached him. Even injured, the Alpha moved with brutal efficiency. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisted hard enough for bone to crack loudly, then slammed the man into the wall before the others could react. The second raised his gun toward Noel. Zayu's expression changed instantly. Noel would remember that look for a very long time. Not anger, not rage, something colder, something possessive. The Alpha crossed the distance in seconds and drove the attacker into the floor with enough force to shake the room. The gun skidded away beneath the bed while the man screamed in pain. The third attacker grabbed Noel from behind and pressed a blade against his throat. "Back off!" Neo cried harder immediately. Noel froze, and the room became deadly quiet. Zayu slowly turned toward them, breathing heavily now from the strain on his recovering body. His eyes locked onto the knife against Noel's throat. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You touched him," Zayu said softly. The attacker tightened his grip nervously. "Stay back or—" He never finished the sentence. Zayu moved so fast Noel barely saw it happen. One moment the Alpha stood several feet away. The next, the attacker crashed against the wall with his wrist bent at an unnatural angle, while the knife clattered uselessly to the floor. The scream that followed echoed through the suite. Zayu shoved Noel behind his back immediately afterward, shielding both him and Neo with his body while staring coldly at the men sprawled across the floor. "Mine," he said quietly. The word sent heat rushing through Noel's chest despite the terror around them. Zayu's gaze never left the attackers. "My family," he continued, voice low and lethal. "No one touches them." Security forces stormed the floor moments later, ending the fight almost as quickly as it began. But by then Noel was shaking too badly to steady his breathing. The fear, the pheromones, the overwhelming alpha pressure surrounding him, everything crashed together until his body began slipping dangerously close to panic heat. Zayu noticed immediately. He turned toward Noel at once, expression tightening as the Omega nearly stumbled. "Noel, I'm fine nel lead weekly." He was not fine. The sweetness of unstable pheromones thickened through the room fast enough that several guards immediately backed away. Neo clung tightly to Noel's shirt, frightened and confused. Zayu stepped closer carefully. "Look at me." Noel tried, really tried, but his body was spiraling too fast. The Alpha's hand settled against the back of his neck, steady and warm. Then Zayu lowered his head toward Noel's scent gland. The temporary mark happened gently. No violence. No dominance. Just the sharp, brief pressure of teeth followed by a wave of stabilizing pheromones wrapping around Noel's collapsing instincts. The relief hit Noel instantly. His knees nearly gave out from it. Zayu caught him before he could fall. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Noel could hear the Alpha's heartbeat beneath his ear. Strong, steady, protective. And for the first time in years, Noel realized he felt safe in someone else's arms. 3 days after the attack at Arclight Medical Center, Zayu Kuro's disappeared from the hospital completely. Officially, the doctors protested the decision. His body was still recovering from severe trauma, and several specialists insisted he should remain under observation for at least another month. But nobody inside Black Snake truly had the authority to stop him anymore, especially after the failed assassination attempt exposed just how unstable the organization had become. By sunrise, Zayu, Noel, and Neo were already inside a private penthouse overlooking the river on the far side of the city. For Noel, the apartment felt unreal. The place was quiet in a way wealth often was, insulated from traffic and noise by thick glass walls and soft lighting. Everything smelled clean, warm, and untouched. There were fresh groceries already stocked in the kitchen, folded clothes waiting inside closets, and a bedroom prepared for Neo with shelves full of toys that had clearly been bought overnight by people who had no idea what children actually liked. Neo loved it instantly. The little boy ran from room to room with wide eyes, hugging stuffed animals against his chest while asking excited questions every few minutes. "Can I really sleep here?" "Yes," Noel answered softly, still looking around in disbelief. "Forever?" That question made the room go quiet. Noel glanced instinctively toward Zayu, unsure how to answer. The Alpha stood near the kitchen counter speaking quietly with one of his men, but his attention shifted toward them the moment he heard Neo's voice. "If you want to," Zayu said calmly. Neo grinned so brightly that something strange tightened in Noel's chest. The child ran directly toward Zayu without hesitation and wrapped both arms around the Alpha's waist. For half a second, Zayu looked startled by the sudden contact. Then his large hand settled carefully against Neo's back. Noel noticed how naturally he did it now, as though protecting them had already become instinct. That realization should have scared him more than it did. The first week inside the penthouse passed more peacefully than Noel could remember any part of his life being. Zayu assigned security outside the building, but inside the apartment itself, the atmosphere slowly became softer, quieter, warmer. Noel cooked for the first time in a kitchen that actually had enough food. Neo stopped waking up from nightmares, and Zayu began learning how to exist in a home that was not built around fear. At first, the Alpha clearly did not know what to do with domestic silence. Noel would catch him standing motionless in the kitchen at midnight staring at the refrigerator as though he had forgotten why he entered the room. Sometimes he sat awake on the living room couch long after everyone else slept, eyes fixed on nothing while old instincts kept his body alert for danger that never came. But little things started changing. Neo dragged him into cartoon marathons on the couch. Noel found him quietly researching children's medicine after Neo caught a minor cold. One evening, Noel walked into the living room and froze at the sight of Zayu asleep beneath a blanket, while Neo snored against his chest with crayons still scattered everywhere. For a man the entire city called the Ice Alpha, Zayu looked unexpectedly peaceful like that. Noel stood there longer than he should have. Then, before thinking too hard about it, he stepped closer and gently brushed dark hair away from Zayu's forehead. The Alpha woke instantly. Noel jerked his hand back in surprise, but Zayu caught his wrist before he could retreat. Their eyes met in the dim light. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Zayu slowly loosened his grip. "Sorry," Noel whispered awkwardly. Zayu stared at him quietly before answering. "Don't apologize for touching me." The words settled somewhere deep inside Noel's chest and stayed there long after he walked away. But outside the apartment walls, the situation surrounding Black Snake was becoming uglier every day. Silu Veron had not stopped moving. Through Black Snake's internal network, Zayu quietly uncovered information even he had not fully known while leading the organization. Illegal suppressor manufacturing, underground Omega trafficking routes, auction houses where wealthy alphas purchased vulnerable Omegas like property. The deeper he looked, the colder his expression became. One night, Noel found him sitting alone in the office near the balcony, staring at files spread across the desk. "You should sleep," Noel said softly. Zayu did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the documents for several long seconds before finally speaking. "I built the system that protected all of this." Noel stepped closer slowly. "You didn't create the whole world. I benefited from it." There was no defensiveness in his voice, only disgust. Noel's gaze drifted toward the papers scattered across the desk. Reports, transactions, medical records connected to suppressor experiments. One file contained photos of bruised Omegas, Noel quietly looked away. Zayu noticed. His jaw tightened visibly. I never cared enough to look closely before. The honesty in that confession hurt more than denial would have. Noel understood then that Zayu's guilt was real. The Alpha was not trying to justify himself. He was realizing piece by piece the kind of world his power had helped sustain. And somehow, instead of frightening Noel, it made him ache for him. Because for the first time, Zayu looked less like a king and more like a man carrying the full weight of what he had become. Late that night, after Neo finally fell asleep, Noel stepped onto the balcony and found Zayu standing alone beneath the city lights. The cold wind moved softly through the silence between them. For a while neither spoke. Then Zayu said quietly, "The doctors told me I almost died." Noel looked toward him. "But that wasn't the part that scared me." His voice lowered slightly. "What scared me was realizing the last thing I heard before waking up was your voice." Noel's breath caught. Zayu finally turned toward him fully. "I kept thinking," he paused briefly, as though unused to saying vulnerable things aloud. "If I opened my eyes and you weren't there anymore." The sentence never finished. It did not need to. Emotion tightened painfully inside Noel's chest. For weeks, he had watched this terrifying Alpha slowly become gentler around Neo, quieter around him, softer in moments nobody else saw. But this was the first time Zayu had spoken about needing them. Not protecting them. Needing them. Noel's eyes burned unexpectedly. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. Something inside Zayu's expression broke at those words. The Alpha looked away briefly, jaw tense, like a man struggling against emotions he no longer knew how to control. Then a sleepy voice interrupted the moment. "Papa!" Both of them turned. Neo stood half awake near the balcony door, holding a blanket in his arms. His tired eyes moved between them before settling lazily on Zayu. "Papa, carry me." Silence. Complete silence. Noel froze, and Zayu looked shattered. The Alpha stared at the little boy like he had been hit directly in the chest. Slowly, carefully, he crossed the room and lifted Neo into his arms. The child immediately curled against him without hesitation. "Sleepy," Neo mumbled. Zayu held him tighter. When he finally looked back toward Noel, his eyes were no longer cold. They looked terrified, as though he had suddenly realized just how much these two people meant to him, and how badly losing them would destroy him. Zayu woke before dawn to an empty bed. For half a second, his mind did not understand what felt wrong. Then instinct hit him so violently that his entire body went rigid. The scent of Noel's pheromones lingered faintly in the apartment, but the warmth beside him was gone. So was Neo. Zayu was already moving before logic caught up. The penthouse security team met him near the hallway with expressions that told him everything he needed to know. One guard lowered his head immediately. The east cameras went down for 37 seconds. Another handed him a phone. A single message glowed on the screen. "If you want your Omega back, come alone." Silo. For several long seconds, the apartment became deathly quiet. Then Zayu smiled. It was not anger. It was worse. The guards standing nearby instinctively lowered their eyes because every alpha instinct in the room screamed the same warning at once. Something monstrous had just woken up. An hour later, black cars moved through the industrial district toward one of Black Snake's abandoned shipping facilities near the river. Rain hammered against the windows while the city lights blurred across wet pavement outside. Inside the vehicle, Zayu sat completely silent. One of his men finally spoke carefully. "Boss, if Silu really leaked the Omega trafficking records, I know. He'll burn the entire organization down." Zayu looked out the window without expression. "Good." The answer stunned the entire car into silence. Because they finally understood. Their boss was not coming back to reclaim Black Snake. He was coming back to destroy it. Meanwhile, inside the warehouse, Noel struggled weakly against the restraints around his wrists, while trying to keep Neo close beside him. The little boy had cried earlier, but exhaustion eventually forced him into uneasy sleep against Noel's shoulder. Across the room, Silu stood calmly beside metal crates filled with illegal suppressors and trafficking records. "You changed quickly," he said almost conversationally. 3 weeks ago, Zayu would have burned cities for power. Now he's willing to throw everything away for an Omega and a child. Noel glared at him. "You don't understand him at all." Silu's expression darkened faintly.
"No.
"I understand him perfectly." He stepped closer slowly. "That's why I know exactly how to break him." A doctor standing nearby prepared another syringe. The moment Noel smelled the chemicals inside it, panic hit instantly. "Heat induction drugs." "No," Noel whispered immediately, trying to pull away. Silu crouched in front of him. "I need Zayu unstable when he gets here." The injection burned through Noel's arm seconds later. Within minutes, his body began reacting violently. His breathing turned uneven first. Then came the heat flooding through his veins, hot enough to make his vision blur. Sweet Omega pheromones spread rapidly across the warehouse until even the surrounding guards looked uncomfortable. Noel clenched his jaw hard enough to hurt. "Not here. Not like this." Neo stirred weakly against him, frightened by the sudden change in scent. "Daddy!" Noel pulled him closer despite his shaking hands. "It's okay," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't look." Then the warehouse doors exploded inward. Gunfire erupted instantly. Black snake guards shouted while bullets tore through metal crates and overhead lights. The room plunged into chaos so fast several men never even realized what hit them. And through the smoke and flashing emergency lights, Zayu walked in. Noel's breath caught painfully. The Alpha looked terrifying. Rain soaked through his black coat. Blood stained one sleeve. His pheromones rolled violently through the warehouse with enough pressure to make weaker Alpha stagger backward instinctively. But his eyes never left Noel. The moment Zayu smelled the forced heat chemicals in the air, something inside him snapped completely. Silu saw it happen too. "That's it," he said softly, almost satisfied. "There's the monster I remember." Several armed men rushed Zayu at once. The fight barely lasted seconds. Zayu moved through them with terrifying precision, every strike fueled by rage sharp enough to suffocate the room. One attacker crashed through a metal railing. Another hit the ground unconscious before even raising his weapon properly. The remaining guards began retreating almost immediately. Nobody wanted to face an Alpha in full aggression state, especially not Zayu Kuros. Silu backed away slowly while chaos spread around the warehouse. "You really destroyed yourself for them," he spat bitterly. "For an Omega who should have stayed invisible." Zayu finally stopped moving. Rainwater dripped from his dark hair while he stared at Silu with complete emptiness. "No," he said quietly. Then his gaze shifted toward Noel and Neo. "I became human because of them." Silu's expression twisted violently. He grabbed a gun from one of the fallen guards and aimed directly at Noel. The shot never fired. Zayu crossed the distance instantly and slammed Silu against the concrete hard enough to crack it beneath him. The weapon skidded across the floor uselessly. For a moment, Noel genuinely thought Zayu might kill him. The Alpha's hand tightened around Silu's throat, while aggression pheromones crushed through the warehouse like a storm. "You were my brother," Zayu said softly. Silu laughed bitterly despite struggling to breathe. "And I was always second." Pain flickered briefly across Zayu's face, then disappeared. When he finally released Silu, it was not mercy. It was finality. Police sirens echoed outside moments later as Black Snake's remaining operations collapsed across the city all at once. But Zayu no longer looked at the empire falling apart around him. He looked only at Noel. The Omega was trembling badly now, body overheating from the forced heat drugs still tearing through his system. Neo clung tightly to him, crying quietly from fear and confusion. Zayu crossed the room immediately. The moment Noel touched him, relief crashed through his entire body, so hard his knees nearly gave out. Zayu caught him instantly. "You're safe," the Alpha murmured against his hair, voice rough with emotion. "I've got you." Noel gripped his coat tightly. "Zayu." The Alpha tilted Noel's face upward gently. Their eyes met through the chaos surrounding them. Then Noel pulled him down into a desperate kiss. It was nothing like their first kiss on the balcony. This one was trembling and emotional and full of fear neither of them could hide anymore. Zayu kissed him back immediately, one hand cradling the back of Noel's neck, while his pheromones wrapped around the Omega protectively. "I thought," Noel's voice broke. "I thought I'd never see you again." Zayu rested his forehead against his. "You will always see me," he whispered, "as long as I'm alive." Then, carefully, deliberately, he lowered his mouth to Noel's scent gland. The permanent mark was not about ownership. It was a promise, a choice, a vow that neither of them would face the world alone again. Months later, Black Snake no longer existed. Its trafficking routes were dismantled. Its illegal suppressor operations exposed. Shelters and medical centers funded by Zayu quietly opened across the city for abandoned Omegas and children with nowhere else to go. And on quiet evenings inside the Riverside apartment, Neo still fell asleep curled between them on the couch, while Noel rested against Zayu's shoulder beneath warm city lights. Sometimes Zayu still woke from nightmares reaching instinctively toward empty space. But now Noel was always there. And every single time, the Omega pulled him back gently with quiet hands and soft kisses until the darkness faded again. And that was the story of how the Ice Alpha, feared by an entire city, was saved not by power, money, or loyalty, but by the quiet voice of an Omega who refused to treat him like a monster. Zayu spent most of his life building an empire through fear, only to discover that the one thing strong enough to change him was love, trust, and the small family waiting for him when the darkness finally ended. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you enjoyed this emotional ABO journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the story with someone who loves healing romance and powerful Alpha, Omega bonds.